My name is Marissa Cole. I am 37 years old. I used to believe Christmas was about family, even if it meant driving hours, working late, and quietly covering bills no one else noticed. But last December, something changed. The emails never came. The family drive folder disappeared. And a voicemail from my mother confirmed the truth. We all agreed you're not welcome at Christmas. At first I thought it was just rejection. But then I uncovered something far worse. They had been planning my erasure long before that night, while I was the one paying every mortgage bill, every utility, every cost that kept their celebrations alive. And when I discovered what they said about me behind closed doors, the decision I made shook the very house they celebrated in. This is not just a story about being excluded, it is a story about what happens when silence turns into proof. When a family that thought they could erase you suddenly faces the cost of what you carried alone. Stay with me, because by the end, you will understand how one quiet decision changed everything they thought they controlled. I did not know it yet, but the proof of everything I feared was already waiting for me, hidden in the places I checked every day without thinking. It was a Tuesday morning in early December, cold enough that the windows in my apartment in Durham carried a thin blur of frost. I sat at the kitchen table with a mug of coffee, cooling too quickly, my laptop open, waiting for something I knew deep down was not coming. Every year since I can remember, by the first week of December, there would be a thread of emails about Christmas. Who was bringing ham? Who was in charge of the pies? What time we would all meet at my mother's house in Charlotte. Sometimes the messages were cheerful. Sometimes they carried an edge of sarcasm. But they were always there. This time my inbox was blank. I refreshed the screen once, then again, then a third time the way you do more out of habit than hope. Still nothing. No subject lines with Christmas, in all caps from my cousin Kaylee. No dramatic reminders from my sister Caroline about labeling serving spoons. Just silence. I told myself maybe they had not started planning yet. Maybe someone was waiting on travel confirmations. But me gut no better. Silence, that exact, that clean, is never accidental. I tried the family drive we had used for years. Each December, it held a folder full of spreadsheets, playlists, evengiftregistries. When I clicked on it, a red message appeared across the screen. Access denied. At first, I thought it might be a glitch, so I tried an old bookmarked link. Same message. Denied. It was like a door that used to swing open freely, now locked from the inside. My phone buzzed beside me. A text from my mother Elaine lit the screen. Her words were simple. Don't worry. I figured you'd be busy this year. No need to stress about Christmas. There was no, we miss you. No, I hope you can make it. Just a sentence that sounded more like a dismissal than care. The kind of message that does not ask for a reply. I stared at it until the screen dimmed, the glow fading as if it was shutting me out too. The apartment was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. I set the phone down and leaned back in my chair. I was not crying. I had stopped crying over things that predictable years ago. But there was a heaviness in my chest. A press of something I could not quite swallow. Familiar. Yet heavier this time. Like a door closing with a finality I could not ignore. I thought of last year. I had arrived at the house in Charlotte later than planned. Stuck in traffic after a client meeting, my arms had been full of wrapped gifts, my hands sticky from carrying a tray of cookies. I had baked at 2 a.m. When I stepped into the kitchen, not a single person looked up. The dining table was full. Every chair taken. My sister Caroline glanced at me and smirked. Look who finally decided to show. I never even caught who muttered it. Because laughter followed, and in that moment, it did not matter. What mattered was that no one moved a chair. No one made room. I ended up balancing a paper plate at the counter, eating standing up while my relatives toasted each other in the next room. I told myself then it was a mistake. Just stress, or holiday chaos. Families forget details. Right. They forget you do not eat pork, or that you always bring deviled eggs. No one admits to liking, but everyone finishes. I let it go. But now, sitting in my apartment with that text burning in my pocket. It did not feel like an accident. It felt orchestrated. Like a meeting had been held, and my name struck from the list. The coffee had gone cold. I poured it into the sink and watched the brown swirl vanish down the drain. Outside, the street was bright, with neighbors stringing up lights. The sound of children shouting as they ran between yards. Inside, the air was heavy. I closed the laptop. Not because there was nothing more to look for, but because I already knew what I would not find. That morning settled into me the way frost settles on glass, thin and invisible, until you breathe and realize you cannot see through anymore. I stayed at the table longer than I should have. My phone face down. The apartment silent, except for the low tick of the clock on the wall. My mother's words replayed in my head. Don't worry. As if the absence of a seat at the table was supposed to be a gift. I pushed the chair back, stood, and walked to the window. Across the street, a family was hauling out an artificial tree. The father adjusting the base while the mother untangled cords of colored lights. It looked effortless. The way they laughed at the mess. The way their daughter clapped when the top finally clicked into place. I watched until my breath fogged the glass, until I had to step back. The silence of my apartment pressed heavier after that. No invitation. No plans. Only the clear understanding that whatever family meant in our house, I was not included in it anymore, and for the first time I let myself feel it, not like a bruise to be hidden, but like a fracture that would not be ignored. I did not reply to my mother's message. I did not send a question to Caroline. I just let the phone stay dark and the room stay quiet, because deep down I already knew this was only the beginning. The phone rang just after 9 that night, while I was brushing my teeth, the vibration rattling against the wooden nightstand. I glanced at the screen and saw the word Mom in capital letters, the same way it had been saved years ago when I first set up the phone. I let it go to voicemail, standing frozen with the toothbrush still in my mouth. When the chime indicated a new message, I rinsed my mouth, sat on the edge of the bed, and pressed play. Her voice filled the room, flat and too rehearsed. We all agreed. You are not welcome at Christmas. There was no hesitation. No sadness. No attempt to soften the words. It sounded less like a mother struggling with a choice and more like a boardroom decision handed down without appeal. I sat very still, my thumb hovering above the screen. The message replayed once. Then again. The same measured tone each time. By the second replay I was saving it, my fingers steady even as my stomach nodded. I knew I would want that recording later. Proof that what I heard was not just in my head. I set the phone on the comforter beside me and stared at the ceiling. The words echoed in my chest, heavier each time they repeated. Not I feel it might be easier. Not it hurts to say this. Just the collective we. The cold verdict. It felt like being voted out of my own bloodline. The next morning, I woke early, restless, from dreams that left me with clenched fists and a pounding head. I reached for the phone as soon as I sat up. The group thread that had been there for years, labeled Holiday Hysteria with Caroline's overdone use of emojis, was gone, not archived, not muted, gone. I scrolled through the other conversations, searching for remnants. But it was as if I had been lifted clean out of their digital lives. Out of habit, I tapped on Facebook, though I rarely checked it anymore. The first post on my feed was a picture of Kaylee, my cousin, holding a wine glass at my mother's dining table. Around her were familiar faces, 12 in total. My mother's hand resting on Kaylee's shoulder like a coronation. The caption read, "Doing what is best for the whole family is not always easy, but it is worth it." I zoomed in on the picture until the pixels blurred. The same chandelier I had helped my mother pick out. The same dining chairs I had ordered and driven down from Raleigh to deliver. Now filled with bodies that had voted me out. My chest tightened. Not with surprise, but with confirmation. There was no empty seat for me. No place card left waiting. I scrolled down and saw a comment from my cousin Nathan. Hard vote, but necessary. Another from Caroline with a line of clapping hands. I closed the app quickly. but the words had already lodged in my chest like a stone. The apartment was quiet again. The hum of the heater, the only sound. I stood at the counter and poured a glass of water I barely drank. My reflection in the kitchen window looked unfamiliar. Eyes darker, shoulders tense. I whispered the words to myself, testing how they sounded outside of my head. We all agreed. Saying it out loud made it real in a way even the recording had not. By noon, I tried to distract myself with work emails, typing out responses that felt mechanical. My phone buzzed again. A notification that the holiday hysteria group had been renamed The Real Ones. The name flashed across my screen like a taunt. I tapped it. But of course, my access was denied. For a moment, I considered calling Caroline, demanding an explanation. But I set the phone down instead. I knew exactly what she would say. That I was too sensitive. That I made things tense. That it was better this way. They always had an excuse wrapped up in a tone that made me feel like the problem. I went back to the voicemail that night, playing it again while I sat at the kitchen table. The same flat voice. The same sentence. It was astonishing how easily a family could edit someone out, as if silence and denial were cleaner than confrontation. I stared at the folder icon on my laptop, where our holiday photos used to be stored, and thought about how quickly things could be erased. Later, while scrolling through old emails, I stumbled on one from last year. Caroline had written an all-caps reminder not to forget table runners. She had included me, had even tagged my name with a sarcastic note about my late arrival. I read it twice, then closed it. The difference between then and now was too sharp. Last year, I was the punchline. This year, I was not even in the room. I pushed my chair back and paced the apartment, the boards creaking beneath my steps. The silence felt different now, heavier, like a house after everyone has left. But the lights are still on. I stood at the window again, watching the neighborhood across the street glow with decorations. Strings of lights twisted around porches, inflatables bobbing in the cold air. Their laughter carried faintly through the glass, distant but cutting. Inside my apartment, there was nothing but the ticking clock and the saved voicemail on my phone. I reached for it one last time before bed. Not to play the message, but to check that it was still there. Saved. Safe. Proof that my absence was not imagined, but decided. I placed the phone back on the nightstand and turned off the lamp. The room settled into darkness, the kind of dark that feels both empty and sharp at the same time. My eyes stayed open longer than I wanted, listening to the hum of the heater, waiting for the silence to soften. It never did. The next morning, I woke with the kind of heaviness that comes from carrying something unresolved through the night. I made coffee and sat at the table with my laptop. Not to check emails this time, but to open the spreadsheet I had kept for years. Rows of numbers stretched down the screen, neat and predictable. Each one, a quiet reminder of what I had carried, month after month. Mortgage, utilities, property tax, insurance. It was all there. I clicked into the mortgage tab and scrolled to the very beginning. January 2020. The first payment, 4 years of steady withdrawals. Each line marked with the same figure, $1,420. 48 months of my life recorded in tidy cells. I traced the column with my finger as if I could feel the weight of it through the glass. That house had eaten more of my income than anything else I had ever paid for. Vacations I had skipped. Clothes I never bought. Dinners I turned down. All so the payment could slide quietly out of my account on the first of each month. I leaned back and rubbed my eyes. For years I had told myself it was temporary, that once my mother got back on her feet, she would take it over. I remembered the conversation in her kitchen when she asked me to co-sign. Her voice had been casual, her hand waving it off like it was no big deal. Just until the bank feels comfortable. Marisa, she had said. We will switch it once things are stable. I had believed her. Because back then, I still believed promises from her. I opened the digital folder where I kept scanned copies of important documents and clicked on the loan file. The PDF loaded slowly, the black text stark against the white background. At the top was my mother's name, Elaine Cole, listed as sole owner. Below that, In smaller type, my own name appeared. Not as owner, not as co-owner, but as co-borrower. The one who made the loan possible but held no claim to the house itself. I stared at the words until they blurred. My chest tightened in a way that felt less like shock and more like confirmation of something I had tried not to see. All this time I thought I was holding us both afloat. In reality, I was just the life jacket she strapped on for convenience. The silent support she could discard whenever she wanted. I pushed the chair back and stood, pacing the length of the apartment. The walls felt too close, the air too heavy. I pulled the document up again on my phone, just to see if the words looked different on a smaller screen. They did not. Owner: Elaine Cole. Co-borrower: Marissa Cole. My jaw tightened. The heater clicked on, rattling softly. But the sound only reminded me of the Utilities tab in my spreadsheet. I flipped back to the computer and opened it. Gas. Electric. Internet. $281 month. $340 another. Depending on the season, every confirmation email still saved in my inbox. I had set all of them to autopay years ago, telling myself it was easier to manage. Easier to keep things steady for her. Easier to not think about whether anyone even noticed. I thought of the nights my mother had hosted birthdays in that house. Lights glowing. Oven running. Laughter spilling into the yard. All of it powered by accounts with my name at the top. No one ever asked if the bills were heavy. No one ever offered to split them. It was just assumed. Marissa will handle it. I closed the spreadsheet and pressed my palms flat against the table. My reflection in the dark laptop screen looked unfamiliar. Harder somehow. The numbers had always been neat. But now they felt like chains. Every dollar tied to a memory I was not even allowed to sit at the table for. I walked to the kitchen counter and pulled a folder from the drawer. The one where I kept physical copies of certain documents I never trusted entirely to the cloud. The paper was crisp. The notary stamp sharp against the corner. I read the language again. Each legal phrase, another nail locking me into responsibility, without recognition. Anger rose in me. Sharp and sudden. Then drained into something colder. Clarity. I had been paying for a house I would never call mine, keeping warm rooms for people who laughed at me from the dining table, feeding a system that had no seat reserved for me. I set the folder down and pressed the lid closed. The apartment was silent again. But this time the silence carried a different edge. It was not emptiness. It was awareness. I made another cup of coffee, though I barely drank the first. The steam curled upward, and I let it blur my vision for a moment before setting the mug aside. I opened a new folder on my laptop and typed 2 words into the name bar. Frozen accounts. My fingers hovered for a moment. Then pressed enter. The screen confirmed its creation. A small square icon waiting to be filled. I copied the mortgage statement first. Then the utilities. Then the insurance records. One by one, they slid into the folder like puzzle pieces fitting into place. Each file another reminder that I had not imagined the weight. That it was real. Recorded. Undeniable. By the time I closed the laptop, the light outside had shifted. The late afternoon sun washing the room in a pale glow. I stood at the window again, watching a delivery truck pull into the neighbor's driveway. The driver carrying boxes wrapped in festive tape. A child clapped from the porch. The sound carried up faintly through the cold air. I stayed there until the truck left, the porch lights flicking on, their house glowing warm against the evening. Behind me, my apartment stayed dim. The folder of evidence now sitting quietly on the desktop. I knew I would return to it, add to it, build it until there was no way to deny what I had carried alone. For now I just let the silence stretch, not heavy this time, but steady, like a decision forming quietly in the background, waiting for its moment. 3 years earlier, I had stood in the lobby of a shipping store in Durham, balancing a stack of carefully wrapped boxes against my hip. Each one was labeled with a name written in my neat handwriting. Each one taped tight with care. I had worked late shifts that week, just to cover the extra cost of expedited shipping. Inside the boxes were gifts I had chosen slowly over months. Small things I thought would matter. A silver bracelet my sister Caroline had admired offhand in May. A scarf, in the exact shade of blue, my mother Elaine used to wear in her old school photos. Ornaments for the tree that reminded me of ones we had when I was a child. I remembered the feel of the cardboard against my arms as the clerk printed out labels. The total was higher than I had planned. But I slid my debit card across the counter without hesitation. It felt worth it. I told myself that when those gifts arrived in Charlotte, my mother and sister would smile and maybe, just maybe, remember that I was part of this family even from miles away. A few days later, I sat at my desk at work during lunch, scrolling through Facebook. The first picture that popped up was my mother's living room, crowded with relatives. Wrapping paper scattered across the rug. I zoomed in quickly, searching for the gifts I had sent. They were there, the bracelet glinting on Caroline's wrist, the scarf draped proudly around my mother's neck, the ornaments hanging from the tree. My chest warmed for a moment until I read the caption. From all of us. I read it again. Slower this time. Waiting for my name. But there was nothing. My sister had written the caption, claiming the gifts as a collective effort. As if I had been folded into a nameless group, relatives commented with hearts and thank yous. No one asking who had picked the gifts, who had sent them overnight, who had stayed late at work to pay for them. My name did not appear anywhere. I sat there in the break room with the phone heavy in my hand. Around me, coworkers chatted about holiday travel plans. But I only heard the echo of my own thoughts. How quickly a person can be erased. How easily gratitude can be repackaged until you are invisible. It had not just been that Christmas. Birthdays passed the same way. The cake for my cousin Nathan had been ordered with my card. But the photos online thanked the family. Decorations I had bought appeared in pictures, tagged as teamwork. Every effort I made was swallowed whole. Renamed. Reassigned. I told myself back then that it did not matter. That gifts were meant to be given without recognition. But sitting in my apartment now, staring at the glow of my laptop, I knew better. It had mattered. It mattered because the pattern was too clean. My presence was never acknowledged. But my money, my effort, my time, those were always welcome. I opened the frozen accounts folder again. The mortgage and utilities files were already there. Now I began pulling receipts from old emails, screenshots of online orders, shipping confirmations. I copied the photo of Caroline wearing the bracelet, the one she had captioned as though it came from everyone. I dragged them into the folder. One by one, evidence, not for anyone else, but for myself, so that, when I doubted, I would remember I had not imagined it. The folder grew. Small icons stacking neatly into rows, each one a record of how my name had been removed, but my effort remained. I scrolled through them slowly, my chest tightening as memories flickered. The scarf around my mother's shoulders, praised, in comments as if it had appeared from thin air. The ornaments shining on the tree that no one admitted came from me. I sat back in my chair, rubbing my temples. My apartment was quiet. The only light, the blue glow from the screen. Outside, laughter carried faintly from a neighbor's apartment where music played. I thought of the laughter in my mother's house that year, the way they had toasted around the tree, my gifts in their hands, my name absent. The silence inside pressed against me, but this time I did not feel crushed by it. Instead, it sharpened something. I realized that what hurt most was not the money or the effort. It was the rewriting of memory. The way a family could cut your name out of the picture and still keep the pieces you had given. I highlighted the files in the frozen accounts folder and created a subfolder titled Erased. My hands trembled slightly as I dragged the photos and receipts inside. It felt like carving space for the truth. A place where my contributions could not be stolen or mislabeled. When I closed the laptop, the room was dark except for the faint light of the street lamps filtering through the blinds. I leaned back in the chair and let out a breath I had been holding too long. The evidence was saved. The memories catalogued. For the first time, I felt the faint outline of control, fragile but real. Like the first crack in ice before it splits wide open. The following morning, the first vibration on my phone came before I even poured coffee. I picked it up, expecting another work email. But the screen showed Nathan's name. My cousin had never been much for conversation outside of family events. So the short message startled me more than I expected. Everything feels easier without you around. I read it once. Then again. Waiting for my brain to catch up. There was no greeting. No buffer. Just that one line. Bare and sharp. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. But I did not type a reply. I took a screenshot instead and dropped the phone back on the counter. The words echoed in my chest. Louder because they were so casual. Easier without you. I moved through the motions of making coffee. Spooning grounds into the filter. Filling the pot with water. But each sound felt distant. The hiss of the machine. The drip into the pot. The smell filling the kitchen. I stared at the steam curling upward, trying to steady myself, when another buzz lit the counter. Tammy, my youngest cousin, 25. The one who always seemed a little out of place at those crowded dinners. Her message was short, but different. Can I call you? I hesitated. Then typed back, yes. The phone rang almost instantly. Her voice was careful. Quiet. As though someone might overhear even through the line. I do not agree with what they did, she said. I have something you need to hear. I straightened in the chair. What do you mean? Tammy, there was a pause. The sound of her breath catching. I recorded it. The way they talked about you last week, I could not let it just sit there. My pulse quickened. She promised to send the file, told me to keep it safe, and then hung up quickly, as if even the call itself carried risk. A moment later, a notification appeared. An audio file waiting in my inbox. I pressed play with trembling fingers. The sound was clear. The background chatter of glasses, clinking faintly behind the voices. Caroline spoke first. Her tone sharp. Dismissive. She is cold. Everything she does feels calculated. Like she wants applause for being decent. My mother's voice followed. Steady and unfeeling. She is not really family. She is just convenient. There was laughter. A ripple of agreement. Then Brian's voice slid in. Measured like he was discussing numbers at the bank. Do not stir the pot. Keep her name on the papers. It is clean. No need to rock the boat. The clip ended abruptly. Silence swallowing the room around me. I sat frozen. The phone heavy in my hand. The words looping in my head. Convenient. Not family. Cold. I set the phone on the table and pressed both palms against my eyes until the darkness behind them sparked. Tears threatened, but did not fall right away. They came slowly. Hot against my cheeks. Not loud sobs, but a quiet stream. I could not stop. For years I had felt the shift. The way jokes carried an edge. The way silence grew around my contributions. But hearing it, said out loud. Recorded in their own voices. Stripped away every doubt. They had sat in a room together. Glosses raised. And reduced me to a utility. Not a daughter. Not a cousin. Not a sister. Just convenient. I reached for a tissue. Then another. But my hands shook as I wiped at my face. The apartment felt smaller. The walls closer. The quiet almost unbearable. I stood and paced. The hardwood creaking beneath my steps. Each word echoed with every pass of the room. Cold. Convenient. Not family. Eventually, I sat again and opened my laptop, dragging the file into the frozen accounts folder. My cursor hovered for a long time before clicking. The icon appeared beside the others. Another piece of proof. This one hurt more than any number on a spreadsheet. I leaned back, staring at the ceiling. My throat tight. It was strange how quickly the line between suspicion and certainty could be crossed. For years, I told myself I might be imagining things. That maybe I was too sensitive. One 10-second recording ended. That debate, forever. The coffee pot beeped in the kitchen, startling me. I poured a cup, though my hands were still unsteady. The liquid sloshing against the rim. I held it between my palms, letting the heat ground me. Though the taste barely registered, I thought about calling Tammy back, thanking her. But the words felt stuck. I knew why she had done it. Why she risked sending the file. She had seen what I had lived. She had felt the undercurrent too. And maybe in her way she wanted me to know I was not crazy. That what I felt was real. The clock ticked past noon. Sunlight filtered through the blinds. Stripes of brightness cutting across the floor. I sat with my coffee cooling beside me. The audio replaying in my head without the need of the phone. Their laughter. Their certainty. Their dismissal. Eventually, the tears slowed, drying sticky against my skin. What settled in their place was something colder. Steadier. A kind of clarity that hurt but also shaped itself into resolve. I had the numbers, the documents, the receipts. Now I had their voices too. I closed the laptop gently and sat still for a long moment, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the faint sounds of life from the apartments above and below. My breathing steadied, the shaking in my hands easing. The truth had been spoken, recorded, saved. There was no undoing it. By the time the sun dropped lower, casting orange light across the walls, I stood and pulled the curtains closed. The apartment dimmed around me. I placed the phone face down on the table and let my body sink into the couch. The quiet returned. But this time it was filled not with doubt, but with certainty. I wiped the last trace of moisture from my cheeks and sat upright. The tears had been necessary, but they were not the end. They were the last surrender before something stronger would take shape. I could feel it waiting. Steady. Cold. Undeniable. I pulled the laptop closer and opened a fresh document. The white screen glaring in the dimness of my apartment, my fingers hovered above the keyboard, hesitating for a breath before I began typing a list. Mortgage. Utilities. Property tax. Insurance. Internet. Gas. Electric. Every account tied to that house in Charlotte. Every thread that bound me to them without acknowledgement. The list stretched longer than I wanted, and with each word my chest grew tighter. I stared at the lines until they blurred. This was the skeleton of my life for the last 4 years. Invisible, yet constant. I had kept them afloat without applause, without even a seat at their table. They had voted me out while still living on what I provided. The thought hardened inside me. If they wanted a family without me, then they could have it. Stripped of the convenience I had quietly given. I reached for a notepad from the drawer and began copying the account numbers by hand. The act steadied me, ink pressing into the page, each digit permanent. Next to them, I wrote the next scheduled draft dates, all neatly lined. January 1st. Mortgage. December 27th. Electric. January 3rd. Property tax escrow. My handwriting looked firmer than it ever had. Each number written like it was part of a contract. The clock on the stove blinked midnight. I poured myself another cup of coffee, stronger this time, and leaned against the counter as the steam fogged my glasses. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted the mug, but the warmth steadied me. For once, the shake was not from fear, it was from the weight of choice. I walked back to the table, set the coffee down, and opened the bank's website. My username and password felt heavier than usual as I typed them in. The dashboard lit up. Clean numbers lined across the screen. The mortgage balance first, bold at the top. I scrolled through the payment history. Row after row of my money sliding away each month. 48 months. All on time. Never a missed payment. At the bottom of the page, a small button waited. Options. My cursor hovered. The drop-down opened with simple commands. Pause. Freeze. Cancel autopay. The words looked clinical, almost harmless. I sat there for a long moment, breathing slowly, feeling the heat of the coffee against my palm. I closed the tab before clicking anything. Not yet ready. The decision needed to be deliberate, not rushed. I opened a new folder on my desktop and named it Evidence. Inside, I began dragging screenshots, mortgage statements, utilities confirmations, tax receipts, homeowner's insurance, Each file slid neatly into place. I added the recording Tammy had sent, the one where my mother's voice called me convenient, not family. I dragged in the Facebook post from Kaylee, smiling with my mother's hand on her shoulder, captioned about doing what was best for the family. The folder grew heavier with each edition, like it was absorbing years of quiet sacrifice. I paused and stared at it, a cold calm pressing into me. I had spent so long doubting myself. But here was the proof. Their voices, their faces, their denial, all documented. I picked up the phone again and reopened the banking app. The mortgage account appeared first. Scheduled payment blinking at me. My thumb hovered over the freeze option. The weight of years pressing behind that tiny button. My stomach tightened as if bracing for impact. I pressed. The screen shifted to a confirmation window. Your request to freeze this account has been submitted. A small green checkmark blinked. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. It was done. I set the phone down gently, as though the action itself carried ceremony. The silence in the apartment changed. It was no longer heavy with loneliness. It was sharp, decisive. The hum of the refrigerator sounded different, like a metronome keeping time with a new rhythm. I turned back to the laptop, opened another tab, and logged into the electric company. The balance was 0, thanks to autopay, but the account details still showed my name at the top. I clicked Manage. The same option appeared. Suspend. I hesitated, then saved a screenshot first, dragging it into evidence. Then I pressed the button. A confirmation email arrived instantly. Service scheduled to end December 24th at 6 p.m. I smiled without meaning to. Gas and internet followed, each one frozen, each confirmation saved. I typed out notes in the notepad beside me. Dimestampet. Account numbers circled. My handwriting steadied more with each entry. This was not chaos. It was clean. By 3 a.m. I had finished. Every account was locked, suspended, or scheduled to cut off. The folder on my desktop brimmed with proof. My shoulders ached from hunching over. But the fatigue felt different. It felt earned. I leaned back in the chair and let my eyes rest on the word frozen accounts printed across the folder icon. The irony almost made me laugh. They had erased me from their Christmas, scrubbed me from chats and photos, but now I had erased their safety net, the quiet machine that kept their house glowing and warm. I drafted 3 emails before bed. The first addressed to the Charlotte Observer reporter I had once worked with on a charity drive. The second to the director of the nonprofit where my mother volunteered. The third to Brian's branch supervisor at the bank. Each draft contained attachments, labeled neatly. I did not write accusations, only facts, documents, receipts, the recording, screenshots of frozen accounts. I saved them all in drafts. Not ready to send, but knowing I would. When I finally pushed the laptop closed, the clock read almost 4. My eyes burned, but my chest felt lighter than it had in months. I walked to the window and pulled the blinds back. The street outside was silent. The pavement, slick from frost. Across the way, a neighbor's house glowed with Christmas lights, blinking red and green in steady rhythm. I watched them flicker against the dark sky. And for once, the sight did not sting. I pressed my palm against the glass, cold seeping into my skin. This was not revenge born of rage. It was survival. It was stepping back from the endless drain of being convenient. They had called me cold. Maybe they were right. Cold was steady. Cold was controlled. Cold knew when to stop feeding a fire that only burned me down. I let the blinds fall back into place and walked to the couch. My body sank into the cushions, exhaustion pulling at me. But beneath it was something firmer. A decision made. A line drawn. The folder on my laptop waited, heavy with proof, patient with silence. My phone sat quiet on the table. Confirmation messages stacked in my inbox. For the first time in years, I was not waiting for their approval, their invitations, their votes. As I closed my eyes, the quiet did not ache. It hummed with certainty, like ice spreading clean across a lake. unbroken. Undeniable. Christmas Eve arrived with a brittle sky. The kind that holds its cold high in the air and lets it sink into the ground. I woke late that morning, stretched across the couch, with the blanket tangled around my legs. My phone buzzed on the table beside me with reminders from the frozen accounts. Confirmation emails stamped with dates and times. I skimmed each one, then tucked the phone back face down. Everything was in motion now. The day passed quietly. I cooked myself eggs, toasted bread, and made tea. I walked to the corner store for milk. The sidewalks nearly empty. Most people already home preparing for their celebrations. My own apartment stayed still. No decorations. Not tree. No gifts stacked in a corner. I had stopped pretending. By evening I sat with a book in my lap, though I barely read the words. My phone buzzed once. Then again. At first I ignored it. But the sound repeated, messages stacking quickly. I leaned forward and picked it up. The screen lit with a flood of texts. Each one from cousins still at my mother's house in Charlotte. The first said power just went out. The next came seconds later. Everything's black. Mom is screaming. Another followed. Catering tried to run the card and it was declined. No one can pay. I stared at the words. The corners of my mouth, tightening though, I did not smile. I scrolled as more arrived. Guests confused. People lighting candles. Kaylee posted in a group chat asking if anyone had extra flashlights. The image formed in my mind too clearly. The crowded dining room gone dark. The turkey cooling in silence. Voices rising as panic spread. A new message popped up. This one, from Caroline. Did you do this? I let the phone rest in my hand, my thumb brushing the edge of the screen. I did not type anything back. I did not need to. Another wave of texts followed. Faster now. Elaine called Duke Energy. They told her the account is inactive. Mom is shouting at customer service, saying it must be a mistake. Then the next one. Sharper. The rep told her the primary holder froze the account. The words settled into me. Colder than I expected. This account has been frozen by the primary holder. A line spoken by some stranger in a call center, but in my mind, I could hear it drop into the room like a gavel. I pictured my mother standing in her kitchen, cordless phone pressed to her ear, face stiff as the words sank in. Brian shifting uncomfortably at her side, realizing what it meant. Caroline pacing, her voice shrill, trying to find someone else to blame. Guests whispering, coats being pulled from the rack. The warmth of the house dissolving into shadows. Another message came from Nathan. People are leaving. Half the table already walked out. Mom looks like she's about to faint. I set the phone on the coffee table. Screen up this time. And watched the messages roll across it like ticker tape. Each one a snapshot of the unraveling. Kids crying because the lights would not turn back on. My uncle trying to start the gas fireplace but failing. Someone's dessert order canceled because the card bounced. In the distance outside my window, the faint sound of car horns echoed from the highway. People heading to their own celebrations. I leaned back, the phone still lighting up with panic. My apartment glowed soft with the single lamp by the couch. The contrast felt almost unreal. Their chaos. My calm. At 6:35, Caroline's name appeared again. Answer me. This is your fault. I let the notification fade. A few minutes later, another text arrived. This time from Tammy. Quiet, as always. They know it was you. No one is saying it out loud. But they know. I picked the phone up, read it twice, then placed it down again. My chest was steady. My breathing even. They had called me cold. Maybe that was true. Cold did not waver. Cold kept its shape. By 7, the messages slowed. The party had fractured. Guests scattering into the night. The last text that came through was from Nathan. Everyone's gone. House is dark. Mom just keeps saying your name. I stood and walked to the window. Across the street, my neighbor's house glowed bright with strings of lights, and a tree framed in the window. Laughter carried faintly across the cold air. Muffled, but clear. I let my palm rest against the glass, the chill seeping into my skin. Behind me, the phone buzzed once more, then went still. I did not reach for it. I let the quiet settle in, steady and unbroken. While their night unraveled in the dark miles away, the morning light crept across my blinds in thin, pale stripes. And for the first time in years, I let myself stay in bed without rushing anywhere. My phone was heavy on the nightstand, still littered with messages from the night before. I scrolled through them lazily, rereading the panic I had already memorized, until a new notification blinked at the top. It was a news alert from the Charlotte Observer. I tapped it open, and the headline pulled me upright. Elaine Cole steps down as host of annual charity Christmas potluck. The article was short, almost clipped. The nonprofit board had released a statement thanking the community but announcing a change of leadership due to inconsistencies regarding donor contributions. My mother's name was missing from the list of acknowledgments. I read it twice, my pulse slow and steady. They had not printed my name, but they had carved hers out. An hour later, my phone rang with a number I recognized from years ago. Rachel Carter, a reporter I had once worked with during a food drive campaign. Her voice was brisk but cautious. I have received documentation about financial support for the Cole property. Can you confirm the authenticity? I walked to the kitchen, poured coffee into a mug, and leaned against the counter. Yes, I said. Every receipt is mine. The payments, the utilities, the mortgage, all of it. Rachel paused, then asked if I wanted to go on record. I told her no. I had no interest in a spotlight. I only wanted the truth to breathe. She thanked me and promised accuracy in her coverage. The call ended with the faint click of her keyboard already typing. By noon, the nonprofit's website had been scrubbed. Photos from the event disappeared. My mother's name vanished from every page that once praised her as a benefactor. In its place was silence, a glaring gap where her reputation used to sit. I sat back on the couch with my laptop resting against my knees. Scrolling through the changes, there was a strange satisfaction in watching her carefully polished image unravel so publicly. She had built her life on appearances, on hosting dinners that looked generous while the weight of it rested on me. Now the mask had slipped, and the world could see the hollow underneath. The messages from my cousins kept coming. Caroline wrote in all caps, demanding to know what I had sent. Kaylee accused me of destroying the family name. Nathan said nothing, just sent an image of the darkened house with candles glowing weakly in the windows. Tammy texted quietly, they are panicking. They blame each other. Later that afternoon, another call came. This one from an unfamiliar number. The man on the line introduced himself as a regional compliance officer for the bank where Brian worked. His voice was clipped, professional. We have received an audio file regarding Mr. Cole's comments on loan documentation. Effective. Immediately, he has been placed on administrative leave while we review. I murmured acknowledgement, gave no extra detail, and let him hang up. The room was silent again except for the hum of the heater. I imagined Brian sitting in his office, blinds drawn, his supervisor playing back the recording of his voice. Do not stir the pot. Keep her name on the papers. It is clean. No need to rock the boat. The irony struck deep. For years he had dismissed me with those exact words, smooth and calculated, as though reducing me to paperwork was harmless. Now those same words had circled back, stripping him of his authority. I pulled my blanket tighter around my shoulders and stared at the snow beginning to fall outside. Each flake hit the glass and melted instantly, leaving thin streaks of water. My chest felt lighter. Not joyful, not triumphant, but steady. Around 3 in the afternoon, Rachel's article went live. This time, it was longer, detailed. It outlined years of payments made by a co-borrower whose name was not listed on the deed. It mentioned utility accounts, insurance, tax records, all tied back to the same individual. The piece never named me, but it did not have to. Anyone who had been at that table, anyone who had laughed at my expense, would know. I closed the laptop and sat quietly. The hum of traffic outside, faint through the walls. I thought about my mother, her phone ringing non-stop, her neighbors whispering. She had always cared more about appearances than anything else. Losing face in front of the community would cut deeper than losing power in her house. By evening, the text slowed. The last one I received was from Tammy. She wrote simply. Grandma asked what happened. No one will tell her. I set the phone down and let the message sit. The house in Charlotte was dark. The charity ties severed. Brian's career cracked open. And my mother's name erased from the board she worshipped. The mask she had worn for years was gone. And for once I did not feel invisible. I poured myself another cup of coffee. Stronger this time. And stood at the window as the snow thickened outside. The city was quiet. The street below, lined with glowing lampposts. My reflection looked back at me in the glass. Steady and unflinching. For the first time in years, the silence around me felt like company instead of punishment. The phone began buzzing again before the coffee cooled in my hands. Caroline's name filled the screen first, followed by a string of messages, each sharper than the last. You ruined everything. Do you realize what you've done? Mom is humiliated. The family looks like fools. I scrolled slowly, reading each line with the same detached calm. I used to read work emails. There was nothing new in her voice. Only blame hurled like it always had been. But this time it landed with no weight. I tapped the screenshot buttons carefully, storing each message, then slid them into the frozen accounts folder. They joined the receipts, the recordings, the photographs. I labeled them Caroline, Texts, Deck 24. It felt mechanical, like filing evidence into a cabinet. And in a way, it was. Minutes later, a new notification lit the screen. My mother's name appeared. The message short. We are still family. That was all she wrote. The same woman who had voted me out and stood in her dining room while my absence was toasted. I stared at the words, my thumb hovering. And then I set the phone down without typing a single letter. The screen dimmed and went black. Her attempt at reconciliation floating there, unacknowledged. The silence stretched for a few breaths before another buzz shook the table. Tammy this time. Her text came through like a whisper compared to the others. They are all fighting. Everyone is blaming each other. I pictured the house in Charlotte. Voices raised. Plates shoved aside. The family fractured under its own weight. Caroline pointing at Brian, accusing him of carelessness with the bank. My mother lashing out at Kaylee for posting pictures that drew attention. Nathan sinking into silence the way he always did when conflict boiled. And Tammy, the quiet observer, sending me glimpses from the edges of the storm. The snow outside thickened, flakes stacking against the window pane. Soft and steady. Inside my apartment, I saved Tammy's message too, sliding it into the same folder. I labeled it Family, Internal, Deck 25. My fingers were steady as I typed. Each keystroke, another reminder that I was not the erased one anymore. I was the one keeping the record. The phone rang suddenly. A call instead of a text. Caroline again. I let it vibrate against the table until it went silent. Seconds later, another call. This time from Brian's number. I muted it before the first ring ended. When my mother tried a moment after that, I turned the phone face down. The screen pulsed with their desperation, but I let it glow unanswered. I stood at the counter, sipping the last of my coffee, and listened to the quiet hum of the apartment. Each buzz of the phone was a contrast. Their chaos pressing against my calm, the balance had shifted. And for once I was not scrambling to explain myself or defend my worth. More texts poured in. Caroline again. Her words jagged. You think this makes you strong, but all you did was tear us apart. Then Brian. Clipped and cold. Do you realize the legal mess you have caused? You will regret this. Finally. My mother again. We can move past this if you stop now. Come home. I screenshotted each one. Dropped them into the folder. Labeled them carefully. It no longer hurt to read. It felt like collecting exhibits for a case I no longer needed to argue. They had given me all the proof themselves. Each message another crack in their facade. Hours passed like that. the storm outside burying the streets in white, while inside my apartment, the folder grew heavier with evidence. I moved between the couch and the window, sometimes sitting, sometimes standing, always steady. The phone never stopped buzzing, but the noise only underscored the distance between us. By late afternoon, Tammy sent one more message. Mom is crying now. Caroline won't stop shouting. Brian left the house. Uncle Todd said he is done helping. It is falling apart. I read it slowly, then saved it. My chest tightened. Not with sorrow, but with something colder, cleaner. This time I was not the victim left outside the door. I was the one holding the record, the one shaping the truth. I closed the laptop and set it on the table. The snow had stopped, leaving the city wrapped in silence. My apartment glowed with the warm light of a single lamp, steady and calm. I let the phone rest face down again. Their voices trapped inside but no longer reaching me. For the first time, I saw the family's unraveling not as my loss, but as their own doing. They had built their foundation on denial, and now it was crumbling under the weight of their choices. I sat back on the couch, blanket pulled around my shoulders, and let the quiet of my space settle deep. This time it was not emptiness. It was proof that I no longer stood outside their storm. The morning after the storm had quieted outside, I woke to a steady throb of notifications waiting on my phone. I reached for it reluctantly, half expecting the same frantic texts from my cousins. But what I found made me pause. An email. Subject line bold in Caroline's familiar style. All capital letters. Legal action. I opened it. The words short and clipped, as if she had dictated them through clenched teeth. We will be pursuing a lawsuit. You have caused financial harm. Prepare yourself. My eyes lingered on the last sentence. Its false authority almost laughable. I read it again. Not with fear, but with the calmness of someone who finally knew where the ground beneath her feet was solid. I took a screenshot, labeled it Caroline, email, legal threat, and dropped it into the frozen accounts folder. The day carried on quietly. I made myself breakfast, fried eggs and toast, listening to the faint hiss of the pan while the city outside thawed under winter light. But by mid-morning my phone buzzed again. This time with a call I recognized. David Miller. A colleague I had once leaned on during messy contract disputes. Someone who never wasted words. His voice came brisk and steady, like the sound of doors closing. Your family is shopping for lawyers. They reached out to a firm in Charlotte, saying you unlawfully froze accounts. I told them they were wasting their money. I straightened in my chair, the phone pressed firm to my ear. So what happens now? David's chuckle was short, almost amused. Marissa, everything is in your name. Every account. Mortgage. Utilities. Property tax. Insurance. Even the internet. You opened them. You paid them. You managed them. That means you hold complete authority. Freezing them is not only legal, it is your right. I let his words settle into me like warm stones in the cold. For months I had carried this suspicion that maybe I had gone too far, that they would find a way to twist my choice into an accusation. But hearing David's certainty stripped that fear clean. He continued, his tone firmer. Even if they find someone willing to file a case, no judge will give it breath. There is no breach. No fraud. If anything, you protected yourself from ongoing exploitation. I closed my eyes, a breath escaping slowly. Thank you, David. He paused. Then his voice softened, almost like a friend more than counsel. You have carried them long enough. They cannot rewrite the law, and you do not owe them explanations anymore. After the call ended, I sat still with the phone against my palm, the words replaying. Entirely legal. Indisputable. Protected. My shoulders eased, tension slipping out as though I had been bracing for an impact that would never come. Not long after, another buzz shook the table. A message from my mother. Her tone trying to wrap desperation in politeness. We spoke with a lawyer. He said, you are within your rights. But Marissa, we are still your family. Why are you doing this? I stared at the words, thumb poised. I could almost hear her voice. The same steady calm she used when scolding children in her classroom years ago. But beneath it now was fear. I saved the screenshot without replying and filed it away with the rest. A few minutes later, another came. I never thought you would humiliate us this way. Everyone is talking. I let the phone dim on its own, her words vanishing into darkness. By afternoon, Rachel Carter's name appeared on my screen. This time as a fresh headline in the Charlotte Observer. The article was concise, but sharp. Legal sources confirmed that all financial accounts related to the Cole property were held in the name of the co-borrower, granting her full authority to suspend or cancel payments. Community members expressed shock at the revelation, many noting the generosity they once credited elsewhere had long been misattributed. I read each line carefully, then closed the laptop. My chest swelled not with triumph, but with something steadier. A kind of justice that hummed quietly instead of shouting. Later, Tammy reached out again. Her text simple. Mom is silent. Caroline keeps pacing. Brian left the house. Everyone is blaming everyone else. I wrote back. Short and calm. Thank you for telling me. The sun dipped lower. Orange light spilling across the apartment walls. I stood at the window with my coffee and watched cars inch carefully down the salted street below. Inside my chest, peace spread wider. The law was no longer something distant or unreachable. It stood at my side like a silent witness, reminding me that I had not overstepped. I had simply stopped being their convenience. That evening the phone rang again. The caller ID read restricted. But I answered anyway. A man's voice introduced himself as a compliance officer from the bank where Brian worked. We are reviewing an audio file in which Mr. Cole refers to documentation practices. Effective immediately, he has been placed on administrative leave. He paused, then asked if I had anything further to share. I kept my tone measured. Everything relevant has already been provided. He thanked me, and the call ended. Crisp as paper, snapping shut. I sat in the quiet afterward, picturing Brian sitting in his office as his supervisor replayed the recording of his own words. Keep her name on the papers. It is clean. No need to rock the boat. Words he thought would keep me trapped had finally trapped him instead. Snow had begun to fall again outside. Soft flakes swirling in the yellow lamplight. I pulled the blanket tighter around my shoulders and let the sight calm me. The house in Charlotte was fractured. The community now knew the truth. Brian's career trembled, and my mother's words of, "We are still family," rang hollow against the reality of legal fact. I turned off the lamp, letting the apartment rest in dim quiet. Their threats had melted into nothing. The silence that remained was not emptiness. It was law, steady and undeniable, standing where their blame could no longer reach me. The knock came late the next afternoon. Soft and patient against my door, I hesitated before opening it. Half expecting another delivery I had forgotten I ordered. Instead, standing there with a small plate covered in foil, was Norma Fisher from 2 doors down. She was bundled in a wool coat, her gray hair tucked neatly under a knitted hat. "I blingled her." Surprised, but she smiled gently and lifted the plate. "Oatmeal cookies," she said. "Figured you might need something sweet." I stepped aside and let her in, the scent of sugar and cinnamon escaping as she set the plate on my counter. Norma had lived in the building for years, but we had rarely spoken beyond polite greetings. Yet now she looked at me with the kind of steady gaze that carried more weight than words. She sat at the edge of my couch, folding her gloves in her lap. "I saw the news," she said quietly. "About your mother. About the accounts. People whisper. You know how it goes." Her eyes softened. "You are stronger than they ever gave you credit for." I stood with my hands wrapped around a mug, unsure how to respond. Norma went on, her voice calm. "I have lived long enough to know this truth. Elaine feared you because she could not control you. That is why she tried to cut you out." The words landed heavier than I expected. Hearing them from someone outside the bloodline stripped away all my old excuses. I sank into the chair across from her, feeling something release in my chest. For the first time in years, someone who was not bound by family politics had seen me clearly. We shared cookies in the quiet of the apartment. The sweetness was simple, almost ordinary. But it steadied me. Norma stayed only a little while longer before standing, slipping her gloves back on. "You do not need them to see your worth," she said, her hand brushing mine as she left. After she was gone, the apartment felt warmer. Not because of the cookies, but because someone had finally broken the silence in kindness. That evening, I made myself dinner. Nothing elaborate. Just pasta with garlic and olive oil. I poured a glass of wine and let a book rest open on the counter while the water boiled. The ritual felt grounding. My space was quiet. But it no longer echoed with loneliness. It hummed with something softer. Steadier. 2 days later, Tammy showed up, cheeks flushed from the cold. A knit scarf half unraveled around her neck. She slipped inside quickly, as if afraid someone might see her. In her hand, she held her phone, already cued to play. "They asked me to talk to you," she said, almost apologetics. She pressed play before I could answer. The recording was muffled at first. Voices overlapping in agitation. Caroline's voice cut through loudest. "We need her back. No one else can handle the bills." Brian muttered something about reputations. My mother's voice shushing him before breaking. "Maybe if she sees we still want her." The file ended abruptly. Tammy looked at me, her eyes searching. "They asked if I thought you would ever come back." I let out a slow breath, leaning back against the counter. "Tell them they should focus on how to keep the lights on before worrying about me." Tammy's lips curved into the smallest smile. Like she had been waiting for that answer. She slipped the phone back into her pocket. "I knew you would say that," she murmured. We sat for a while with mugs of tea between us, the steam curling into the dim light. She told me about her graduate program, about papers she still needed to finish. I listened, grateful for the normalcy, grateful that our conversation did not circle endlessly around my mother's house. When she left, she hugged me briefly, her scarf brushing against my cheek. "Be well," she whispered. The apartment door closed behind her, and I stood in the stillness with my tea. My laptop rested on the table, the frozen accounts folder heavy with proof. But I did not open it. Instead, I looked around my space. Small but mine. The lamplight glowing across the walls. I thought about the noise in Charlotte, the arguments Tammy had described, the fractured voices in the recording. For so long I had mistaken their chaos as proof that I belonged, that I had to keep fixing, paying, smoothing. But here, in this quiet, I realized peace was worth more than any invitation or apology. I rinsed the cups, set them on the rack to dry, and let the hum of the refrigerator fill the silence. For the first time, I did not ache to be part of their table. I felt grateful to have walked away from it. The next week, I drove across town to the bank. The road still edged with dirty snow from the last storm. The sky hung low and gray, the kind of winter morning that makes the world feel quiet before it stirs awake. I parked, shut off the engine, and sat for a moment with the folder on the passenger seat. Mortgage transfer, printed in red ink. Inside were notarized forms, account records, every piece of proof I had prepared. When I stepped inside, the warmth of the building wrapped around me. The faint smell of coffee drifting from behind the counters. A young teller greeted me and directed me to a loan officer's office. I followed the carpeted hallway, each step steady, each breath slow. The officer looked up from his desk as I entered, his smile professional but neutral. I placed the folder on the desk, sliding it toward him. "I need to remove my name from the mortgage on a property in Charlotte. The account is in both names, but the title belongs solely to Elaine Cole. She will assume full liability." He adjusted his glasses and opened the folder, scanning the documents carefully. His pen tapped once against the desk before he nodded. "You have the notarization. This is complete. By signing here, you release any responsibility tied to this loan." I took the pen, the weight of it firm between my fingers, and signed my name one last time. The officer stamped the papers, the sound sharp against the quiet office. It was done. The house no longer tethered me. The mortgage. The taxes. The endless bills. They were no longer mine to carry. As I walked back to my car, the cold bit against my cheeks, but I felt lighter. My boots crunched against the frozen sidewalk. Each step an exhale. Back in my apartment in Durham, I set my laptop on the table and opened the frozen accounts folder one last time. Screenshots. Receipts. Recordings. Every file lined up in neat rows. For months, it had been my shield. My record of survival. I scrolled slowly, then closed the lid. It was not a weapon anymore. It was a period at the end of a long sentence. I made myself coffee. The familiar sound of the machine filling the room. The smell drifted warm through the air as I settled by the window. Mug cupped between my hands. Outside, the snow had begun again. Flakes drifting soft and steady. Coating the street in white. The world looked quiet. Almost new. I whispered the words out loud. Not for anyone else, but for myself. I did not destroy them. I only stopped giving them access to my sacrifice. The truth landed like a stone dropped into still water, rippling out but settling steady. For years I had believed that love meant giving without end. That loyalty meant silence, even when it cut deep. But sitting in that small apartment, watching snow fall across Durham, I finally understood. Walking away was not cruelty. It was survival. My phone sat on the table. Dark and silent. No new messages. No threats. No pleas. And I did not reach for it. Instead, I took another sip of coffee and let the warmth fill me. A reminder that peace could be this simple. If you have ever carried a family that refused to see you, if you have ever poured yourself into people who only called you convenient, I hope you hear this. You are not weak for walking away. You are not cruel for choosing yourself. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is freeze the access to your sacrifice and step back into the light of your own life. I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to choose peace over obligation? Or walk away from a table that no longer had a seat for you? Share your story in the comments. Tell me where you are watching from. And if this story touched something in you, make sure to subscribe so you do not miss the next one. There are more stories ahead. More voices to be heard. And more truths we are finally ready to tell together.